So we're going to go right into the practice questions. Everything here, top to bottom, just get it done. I need to, yeah, here we go. We'll come out to this so that I can make our notes. Which movements is the gluteus maximus responsible for? So let's do it right now. Ask yourself, when do you work the glutes? What we're seeing is concentrically accelerating, right? So what we want to remember is concentrically accelerating is one of the ways that they mean working, right? So when are you working your glutes? Go one plane at a time. In the sagittal plane, do we work the hips in? And here are our options: hip pronation, hip flexion, hip extension, hip adduction. A is out and B is out, right? Because this hip pronation is not even a thing. And well, for us, it's not a thing. Hip adduction, remember, we don't have the glutes in the lateral frontal plane. We only have the two. So this brings us between B and C. And this is why it's important that we memorize the concentric, and then we can work every question from there. But you can't skip that step. So when are we working our glutes? Are we working them when we come down into hip flexion or when we drive up into hip extension? And it's going to be C. So you can see that we don't even need the rotations part. A lot of them are going to be like this, where the first one is enough for you to rule it out. I mean, for you to identify it and then rule out the other one. But we can also, let's do it. Let's, we're doing it for practice, so we better know it, because they might only give you one. And if they were only asking about the rotations, then you would want to know that the glutes also, they do work in the transverse plane. Remember, you work those glutes when you're externally rotating. So that works. Okay, so these are going to be those two big things that if you had memorized those, then we're ready, because we see concentrically accelerating. We're like, all right, when are we working the glutes? That's all that they're asking. Now, let's look at the next question. I think it's the exact same wording. I did keep that. Which movements is the gluteus maximus responsible for? But this is not at all the same answer. So what we're seeing here is eccentrically decelerating. So we ask ourselves, when are the glutes breaking, right? And we're looking for the opposite of the work phase or the concentric, the isolated, however you want to think about it, isolated function, concentrically accelerating, right? All of those. But it's the opposite of those, right? So this time we can't pick, right? They're going to give us concentric or eccentric. So we know from above, we already talked through it. The glutes are working with hip extension and hip external rotation. So when are they slowing us down? Hip flexion and hip internal rotation, right? So this is going to be slowing down those movements. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is this is the way that you're going to see them on the test. Remember when we took our like one step forward at a time to make it make sense, we said hip extension and hip external rotation, but you don't see it that way. Hip extension and external rotation, but they're two separate things. All right. What does the latissimus dorsi isometrically stabilize? Right? So what do the lats stabilize? So we just look for the joint that is next door to the muscle. Cervical spine does not make sense. It's not by your neck. Foot and ankle, no. Knee joint, no. Low back, yeah. But remember, for this one, it can also be shoulders above. That's the only one that has the two. All right, what is the integrated function of the gastrocnemius? So this one, we got to ask ourselves, this is a legit question, right? Because let's look at our answers. Decelerate, ankle dorsiflexion. Decelerate, the opposite, ankle plantar flexion. Accelerate, ankle dorsiflexion, or accelerate, ankle plantar flexion. So the key word here, I asked this intentionally, the hardest way possible, to make sure that we're doing the right process. Not just what do the calves do, but knowing the difference between isolated and integrated. So isolated equals the work, right? Integrated equals the breaks. So what we want to do is figure out the calves work during plantar flexion, right? our calf raise, and then flip it for deceleration. Right? So that is going to be the dorsiflexion. Right. So let's just go through them again, one by one, to make sure that we're applying this correctly, because this is a super important question. The calves accelerate plantar flexion. So D is correct if it's the isolated function of the gastroc, right? So, D would have been the correct answer if one word changed in the question, and it is not gastrocnemius. It is, that would be the answer if it said, what is the isolated function of the gastroc? When is the gastroc the star? When is the gastroc working? And that's going to be during plantar flexion, doing your calf raise. But that's not what they're asking. So C is out, right? Because that's not one of the options. The only two things that the calves are going to do is accelerate plantar flexion and decelerate the opposite. So we need to come to the decelerations, but they cannot decelerate ankle plantar flexion because that's when they're contracting. So you can't slow something down when you're speeding something up. All right, so that one is out because it's wrong. It's backwards. So A is the correct answer. And if we did it the way that I prefer to do it is, okay, they're asking integrated. The isolated is when we're doing the work. So when we're working is the plantar flexion, but that's not what they're asking. So look for the breaks. We decelerate the opposite of plantar flexion. Flip it over, it's dorsiflexion. All right. Which muscle should you ensure proper extensibility of prior to doing a medicine ball pullover throw? So when you see this, proper extensibility, this means must be able to stretch, lengthen, okay? And a medicine ball pullover throw. So here's where you got to know the exercises. But this is that one where your back is on the stability ball, your arms are overhead, and you're going to crunch up and throw the ball. So just remember, anything with arms overhead equals lats, tight lats, arms overhead. This is one of those Pavlovian things that we've had right from the beginning, and we don't ever want to forget it. So we're talking about it now in a different context, but we also know you're working your lats during shoulder extension. So if you're going to lay back like this and pick this ball all the way up overhead, you've got to be able to stretch your lats all the way out because you're in shoulder flexion. So they stretch during shoulder flexion, which is lifting arms overhead. One thing that I meant to say earlier was if you are not clicking yet with the biomechanics terms, go back to the Start Here video and watch that, because that is like, you've got to know those. You've got to know the movements for everything else to work. Proper extensibility of which muscle allows for optimal hip flexion? Pecs, hip flexor complex, biceps femoris, psoas. So now we have to ask ourselves, which muscle is stretching during hip flexion? So if we want to flex our hip, this is going to be, like I would say, leg swing. Is probably the easiest because like it's, it's the dynamic that you kind of feel it in your body. So you need to know what is hip flexion, getting closer at the hip, and how do we engage that? So if we would swing front, that would be a hip flexion. And then we ask ourselves, what is stretching? What muscle is stretching during this, right? Your hip flexor complex is doing something, but it's not stretching. It is contracting, shortening, and it's going to be passive, right? But it doesn't matter. It's still getting shorter. So it's going to be your hamstrings. So again, you need to know that the biceps femoris is going to be the #1 muscle of the hamstrings. Okay. An activity of daily living that involves squatting is, so this is just one from our tables of the 5 movement patterns. So do we squat when we lift a gallon of milk, when we reach for a plate overhead, when we pull weeds, or when we get out of a car? So hopefully you can see right away that it's D. But if we had the others, let's look at what those questions would be. So this would be lifting the gallon of milk would be an upper body pull, but they're not going to call it upper body. They're going to call it pull. Reaching for a plate overhead is going to be anything overhead is in the press. Pulling weeds is going to be hinge, aka lower body pull. Which movement pattern is utilized during a Romanian deadlift? So you just ask yourself, which of the 5 movement patterns am I doing? And this is going to be lower body pull, right? Which is our hinge. And if they had asked a squat, then anything squat related would be, well, it would be a squat, right? Because that's going to be our lower body push. Okay. The